The Clerk.
Government business, order of the day number 2, Telecommunications Legislation Amendment, Competition and Consumer Bill 2019, resumption of debate on the second reading.
I understand it is the wish of the House to debate this order of the day concurrently with the Telecommunications Regional Broadband Scheme Charge Bill 2019. There being no objection, the Chair will allow that course to be followed. So the question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Greenway.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment, Competition and Consumer Bill 2019 and the Telecommunications Regional Broadband Scheme Charge Bill 2019, and I move the second reading amendment circulated in my name. Labor supports the establishment of a statutory infrastructure provider regime outlined in this bill. The proposed framework will provide additional certainty that as we move beyond the initial rollout of the national broadband network, every Australian premise can continue to access a high-speed broadband connection. This is, of course, a natural extension of the arrangements Labor put in place nearly 10 years ago through a Statement of Expectations issued to the NBN Board. The Statement of Expectations required NBN Co to make high-speed broadband available to all Australians regardless of where they live or work. This will continue to happen, and this bill provides that certainty. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not lost on anybody that after more than a decade in power through the 1990s and 2000s, the Liberal National Party had left Australia in a broadband backwater. It was Labor who carved out the principle that all Australians should have access to modern communications infrastructure. It was Labor who stood up for the regions, not with rhetoric, but with a considered policy to deliver universal access to high-speed broadband, universal pricing and investment to make that a reality. The Liberals and Nationals tried to prevent it. They did nothing to promote competition. They did nothing to promote investment. They privatised Telstra as a vertically integrated monopoly. The only thing promoted by the Liberals over that sorry period was stagnation and higher prices in our regions. Labor in government put an end to that mediocrity. Now, one of the things that galls me is the government is today seeking to progress a broadband tax, supposedly in the name of regional funding. Yet we recently learnt that in the 2020 corporate plan, regional investment in the NBN was actually reduced by $200 million. This is despite NBN Co incorporating revenues from this unlegislated levy into their corporate plan. Now, it raises a legitimate question. Why is this government progressing a broadband tax in the name of regional funding while cutting regional NBN investment at the same time? And why did the government try to conceal this funding reduction in the NBN corporate plan? The fact is, the information that would have revealed this funding reduction was left out, despite it being regularly published in the previous corporate plans. We only found out because the Senate sought access to the data, which clearly shows a $200 million reduction of capital expenditure in the fixed wireless network. We are before the House today to consider legislation to introduce a new broadband tax on the telecommunications sector. On the 28th of November 2019, the Senate referred the Telecommunications Regional Broadband Scheme Charge Bill to the Senate Environment and Communications Legislation Committee for inquiry. But before I go into the bill, it's important we cover some of the history. Prior to the 2013 election, Malcolm Turnbull and others were encouraging private companies to compete directly with the government-owned entity. Now, they didn't do this out of principle. They did this because they wanted to wreck the NBN. They wanted it to fail because it was a Labor conception. Then, 10 days after the 2013 election, TPG announced it wanted to expand a fibre-to-the-basement network in inner-city areas to up to 500,000 homes. Now, as you would expect, this created alarm both within NBN Co and subsequently within the government. They understood as anyone with common sense understood, that if TPG began cherry-picking profitable parts of the fixed-line NBN footprint, then the economics of the project would become unstuck. This was not in the interest of taxpayers, and it was not in the public interest, given that the NBN ship had already sailed. The concept of what was to become the proposed broadband levy was given to the government-initiated Vertigan Review in 2014, which examined different options to offset NBN's losses in fixed wireless and satellite networks. Now, the minister claimed that the government adopted this levy because it was a recommendation of the Vertigan Review. And I quote, "The legislative package to be introduced shortly implements the recommendations of the Vertigan Review, which were reported in 2014. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is not entirely accurate. Allow me to quote what the Vertigan Review report actually said. "By far, the best option for funding any ongoing subsidy would be through consolidated revenue. Among other advantages, that would allow Parliament and the public to assess in an ongoing way the benefits of using taxpayer funds for this purpose rather than others. However, should that option not be adopted, the panel recommends that, if an ongoing subsidy is required and its minimum amount can be reliably determined, a single annual broad-based industry levy covering both voice and broadband services be imposed to fund that subsidy. This would be similar to the current arrangements for the universal service obligation, which are outlined in Appendix 3. So let's make two things clear. First, the Vertigan Review did not recommend a levy on the industry and consumers as its first preference. Its preference was funding from consolidated revenue. Second, the levy recommended by the review was a broad-based levy. The bill before us does not propose a broad-based levy. What the government has done is design a levy with a narrow base in order to produce a high charge. The reason they have done this is for the purpose of preventing competition. And then the industry has to put up with the unedifying spectacle of the minister writing an op-ed pretending this bill is all about being pro-competition. Now, this brings me to an important point. The Coalition has built an inferior NBN for $51 billion. It has cost more than the original fibre network to build. It costs more to operate. It offers slower speeds. It's less reliable. It requires more funding to upgrade than would not have been necessary under the original plan. It would not have been necessary under the original plan. It is more exposed to competition. And as of a fortnight ago, Australia had fallen to 68th in the world for broadband speeds and 4th last in the OECD, according to the Speed Test Global Index. And even as soon as yesterday, the ACCC took what can only be described as a direct swing at the performance of fibre to the node following its latest broadband speed monitoring report. And I would point out, Madam Deputy Speaker, that fibre to the node is actually the most prevalent fixed-line technology in regional Australia. The ACCC stated, and it wasn't subtle, it was very direct, and I quote, "Many high-speed fibre-to-the-node connections still don't come close to performing as promised. The results show that about a quarter of those consumers on FTTN connections who are paying for high-speed 50 megabits per second and 100 megabits per second plans still did not receive anywhere near their full plan speeds at any time." At any time. And Mr Sims, the ACCC chairman, went on to say, "This Measuring Broadband Australia data clearly shows that too many consumers with fibre-to-the-node connections are not receiving the speeds they are paying for." So it's a very valid question that Australian consumers should be asking, including those in rural and regional Australia. Why has this government built a $51 billion network that is still not delivering the speeds that Australians are paying for? And I would note, Madam Deputy Speaker, at a speech to CEDA last year, the minister said, we are going to need to rely on and boost competition to make sure that our fixed networks continue to upgrade and stay in tune with world developments. Yet the legislation proposed by the Minister directly contradicts that statement. It actually achieves the opposite. It's the sort of doublespeak that the industry is sick and tired of, that consumers are sick and tired of, and the industry expects better than this. What the government is asking the sector to believe is a legislative package headlined by a new broadband tax should be seen as a gift to improve competition. Now, while it may be inconvenient to concede, the primary reason the government instigated the levy was to deter TPG from cherry-picking inner-city basements, given the negative impact this would have on the economics of the NBN. Now, most of industry, including Labor, support that objective. I've always been upfront about that because I believe it is in the interests of taxpayers and it's in the long-term interests of the project. Yet from the outset, this government has been too insecure to acknowledge this as an objective of their policy. Instead, to give the appearance of having a more neutral purpose, the levy was expanded into greenfields networks. Now, the greenfield networks don't cause revenue leakage to NBN Co. And in fact, if it wasn't for operators such as Opticom, for example, peak funding for the NBN build would be higher than it is today because the NBN would have had to fund construction in those areas by itself. And how does this supposedly pro-market, pro-investment Liberal Party reward them? With a tax on their operations and on their customers. Furthermore, the levy was also extended to enterprise markets. Not only is there no revenue leakage to NBN Co, but we have a situation where NBN Co often causes revenue leakage to the incumbent. And this was captured well in a submission by Optus, which noted, and I quote, "The provision of services to enterprise and government customers over non-NBN networks does not displace any NBN Co protected revenue or preclude NBN Co from making sufficient revenue from its metro connections to internally cross-subsidy the fixed wireless and satellite networks." Labor has focused on introducing a legislative amendment to help grandfather existing greenfields networks built before the 1st of July 2019 until the policy could be revisited at a later time. We did not consider the retrospective application of the levy to be fair, as greenfields did not pass the test of causing revenue leakage to NBN Co. So, as I recently noted, I was surprised to see the Minister, in an opinion piece, characterise this exemption as a pro-competitive measure agreed between the government and Labor. It is almost as though the government, concerned it has no credibility on this matter, is trying to cling to Labor and claim we're on some sort of unity ticket when it comes to competition policy. The fact is this: the greenfield exemption was a Labor amendment that had the backing of crossbench senators. To imply it was worked up and somehow agreed between the major parties is a disingenuous description of what occurred. The government chose to adopt this amendment because Labor has secured the votes to pass it. Further, if the government considers the ALP amendment to be pro-competitive, then what does that say about the original bill? And on this note, I'll run through some of the comments made by the industry itself. From Vodafone: "Not only will the RBS perpetuate the trend of opaque and anti-competitive telecommunications policy, it will chill investment in both fixed and mobile telecommunications infrastructure." And from Opticom, Senator Urquhart at the public inquiry: "Will the broadband levy increase or decrease the incentives that you have to invest?" Opticom: "It would decrease." Telstra, again Senator Urquhart at the hearing: "Will the proposed levy increase or decrease the incentives that private sector carriers have to invest in their own fibre infrastructure?" Telstra: "I think logically it would decrease those incentives." From Vocus: "The likely effect of limiting the RBS charge base exclusively to fixed-line, high-speed broadband services will be to further incentivise private sector investment in mobile and fixed wireless services, which will increasingly be capable of undercutting NBN prices as they will not be subject to the RBS levy, and to further disincentivise investment in fixed line services. From Internet Australia, in many respects, the new RBS is anti-competitive in structure and scope and designed more to prop up the NBN funding regime than to enable open and transparent infrastructure competition to improve and advance broadband service availability in regional and remote areas. I now want to run through Labor's position on the bills. For starters, Labor supports the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment Competition and Consumer Bill. It's by and large sensible, and for the reasons I outlined earlier, Labor will support it. The broadband levy that has been proposed by this government is highly regrettable. The criticisms levelled at the government's levy design by the ACCC, the Productivity Commission and industry are fair criticisms. It is distortionary. It is anti-competitive. It has been poorly designed. It does present legitimate implementation issues. It is all of those things. And that is why Labor has pursued an amendment to reduce the impact of the levy on greenfield consumers, which has actually been incorporated into the bill. But I put on record that we do have outstanding concerns about the levy, as do many others in the sector. The first is a lack of transparency in relation to the modelling upon which this levy is based. Explanations given by public officials about why the model has not been updated have been unsatisfactory. I genuinely do not understand why the government simply doesn't do this. There's broad agreement that the modelling on which the levy is based is out of date. They've had 2 solid years to update it, and at every opportunity that reasonable request has been ignored. The BCR issued its first consultation in May 2015, with the government responding in December 2016. As a result, the legislation we are now debating is based on work performed half a decade ago, when NBN's fixed wireless and satellite network rollouts were still in their infancy. Today, the fixed wireless and satellite networks are largely complete some 5 years later. The real-world costs are better understood, particularly in relation to fixed wireless, which has been more expensive than originally envisaged. The existing costings are out of date, and there is general agreement they should be updated. Taking all this into account, Labor will introduce an amendment to the Senate to require an updated RBS model to be produced, and we will consider putting this exercise in the hands of the ACCC. The modelling should be independent, transparent, and based on the best available data. Stakeholders have a right to expect a higher standard of transparency in relation to a taxation bill, and there was broad support for this additional transparency during the public inquiry. The second concern relates to the grant-making mechanism. Both NBN and non-NBN networks will be subject to a levy that is collected by the ACMA and then paid back to NBN Co through a departmental grant. In accounting terms, we're not talking about a trivial amount of money. All up, the levy is $800 million per annum. The question is, what actually happens when that $800 million flows into NBN Co? What we do know is that NBN Co doesn't need $800 million a year to operate and upgrade the fixed wireless and satellite network going forward, not even close to that amount. So the question is, where does that excess money go? The answer is the surplus, in effect, goes wherever NBN Co wants it to go. The money comes in and will likely be washed through an account with an endless pool of historical non-commercial losses. An NBN accountant presumably then takes out a pen, signs a piece of paper and declares the excess revenue offsets a historical loss that NBN Co probably never intended to recover anyway. And then the money goes straight back into the core business. There is no requirement to spend the surplus tax revenue on regional networks, even though that is the impression this bill has created for some stakeholders. If NBN Co wants to direct it towards the HFC cost blowouts, then that's where it will go. If they want to spend it on IT systems, that's where it will go. In practice, this all appears permitted. Now, this is not a criticism of NBN Co itself. Rather, it is an observation that the bill before this House is not a regional funding mechanism. It is an administrative charade. It deters cherry-picking and raises a bit of new revenue. Yet look at how much legislative complexity and red tape has been created to give the illusion that it's a funding mechanism. Now, how did the government manage to develop such a nonsense? This is the same directionless overreach that undid the Spectrum Review. It's the same mediocrity that plagued the USO Review, whose only output was a new acronym. The sector deserves better than this. Consumers deserve better. Regional Australia deserves better. The final concern I have is about who bears the burden of the enterprise levy. This government is imposing a wholesale tax on telecommunications providers supplying enterprise markets. Enterprises are arguably the only bunch getting a good deal out of the NBN under the multi-technology mix. Prices for enterprises are coming down because of NBN having entered an already crowded market of competitors. Yet the best idea this government could come up with was a levy on the incumbent telcos. The competition in the enterprise market means that providers are strongly competing to win customers or to avoid losing them. This makes it difficult for the levy to be passed through to enterprises, which have more of a capacity to pay it. NBN Co stated before the public inquiry that they do not price the levy into their enterprise products because their pricing is dictated by the market. Now, this suggests the industry will likely bear the brunt of this levy. So we have a situation where consumers will pay higher prices as a result of the government's tax, whereas the telecommunications industry will likely take the brunt on behalf of large enterprises, and that simply doesn't seem right. It's my view that the industry should not have to absorb the government's enterprise tax from their bottom line. We can't see an immediate or effective legislative solution to this, but it's one that the government is urged to give consideration to. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I have noted, for Labor to oppose the levy outright would hurt the long-term economics of the NBN, which is not in the public interest, and this is consistent with our position in the previous term of the Parliament. That is why Labor pursued an amendment to reduce the impact of the levy on greenfield consumers, which has been incorporated into the bill, and will continue to reserve the right to pursue other measures, as I've indicated, when this matter comes before the Senate.
Thank you. Can I just clarify you've moved an amendment on this? Thank you very much. So is the amendment seconded?
I second the amendment.
Thank you to the member for Ballarat. So the original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for Greenway has moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I give the call to the member for Jelly-Brand.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to rise in this debate on two separate but related bills, the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment Competition and Consumer Bill and the Telecommunications Regional Broadband Scheme Charge Bill. Labor supports the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment Competition and Consumer Bill and the establishment of a statutory infrastructure provider regime outlined in it. The regime will provide additional certainty that as we move beyond the initial NBN rollout, every Australian home and small business continues to have a right to access to a high-speed broadband connection. You'd hardly expect Labor to have an issue with this, given that it flows naturally from the arrangements that we put in place a decade ago through the Statement of Expectations issued to the NBN Co board. The Statement of Expectations at that time required the NBN Co to make a high-speed broadband available to all Australians, regardless of where they live or work, and this bill provides certainty that that will continue. Labor wants today what it wanted a decade ago when we conceived of the National Broadband Network. We want every home and every small business in this country to have access to reliable, affordable, high-speed broadband. When the Rudd government was elected in 2007, Australian internet speeds and access badly languished. I mean, it really languished. The average connection speed was about 2 megabits per second, which ranked us shamefully low in ranks of global speeds. Today, the internet is profoundly woven into our lives. It's very hard to overstate its influence. In the 1980s, the author and journalist Tom Wolfe coined the phrase the masters of the universe to describe the potency of a new generation of young, ambitious Wall Street bankers. Well, today, the new masters of the universe reside in Silicon Valley. The Howard government, though, apparently never saw this coming. The internet launched 5 years before that government was first sworn in this country and proceeded to ignore this increasingly central phenomenon for more than a decade. It was the Rudd government's sorry inheritance in 2007, a telecommunications infrastructure in this country that had badly suffered through neglect and indifference. Infrastructure that lacked a vision and imagination leading its rollout. Infrastructure so inadequate that Australia was handicapped, and not just economically. It was what Labor, the Rudd government, sought to address through the National Broadband Network, and it was Labor that asserted the principle of universal access to modern technology, to fast, reliable internet. Those opposite were fiercely opposed to this principle. Those opposite called it delusional. You really had to drag them, kicking and screaming, into the future. Labor understood the importance of the internet. We understood that it was world-changing technology, and the fact that we lagged behind much of the world in our access to it was an imperative to be remedied by the government. Labor understood its influence and acknowledged that its influence would only grow, sometimes in ways that we couldn't yet imagine. It would change the way that we consumed, sold, exported, imported, taught, learnt, communicated. It would change the way we listened to music and watched films. It would change the way we created and received news, and would have ramifications for health, finance, even dating. It would have ramifications really for every component of our lives, and this is how fundamental the underlying infrastructure was. The Howard government, however, didn't care or didn't know, didn't understand it. Labor is proud of the vision that the Rudd government offered to Australians in the form of the National Broadband Network, proud particularly of its principle of universal access. So the National Broadband Network was born. It was an ambitious, nation-changing project, but one with a simple motto: do it once and do it right. That meant connecting the vast majority of homes in this country with high-quality fibre to the home connections, fibre that's quick and enduring, fibre that lasts, fibre that's future-proof. The network was simply too important to be compromised by political expediency or ignorance, but unfortunately that's exactly what has happened. In 2020, we have a network that is badly compromised. Having neglected the internet up to 2007, the coalition government has now neglected the National Broadband Network. Those opposite aren't great friends with the future. In 2013, the degradation of the NBN began when the coalition was elected. And this occurred with forewarning to the Australian public, because when Tony Abbott gave Malcolm Turnbull the communications portfolio in 2010, he told the Australian public that Malcolm Turnbull would, quote, demolish the NBN. Those were his writing instructions, and sadly he got to it when they won the 2013 election. It was one of the few election promises that they really did keep. When Malcolm Turnbull came into the communications portfolio with the ignorant boast that he could deliver Australia a completed network much faster and much cheaper, he was wrong. He was badly wrong. The Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government stopped an at-scale national rollout of the NBN. It stopped an at-scale rollout of high-quality, future-proof fibre to the home in favour of what they called a multi-technology mix. A dog's breakfast might be a better description for it, in which a patchwork of legacy networks was sweated throughout the country to cover the nation. They didn't just set out to retain the ageing legacy copper wiring for a fibre-to-the-node network deployment. They actively started buying new copper to roll out across the nation, putting Australia on our own in the country of investing in the past. It was like a nation greeting the arrival of the automobile age by purchasing new fleets of horses and carriages. They did it anyway, and they boasted of saving money, except that it didn't. If your home wasn't utilising the old copper system, it was serviced by a mix of inferior fibres, HFC and the like, and this required future upgrading, unlike the original plan. And guess what? The mixed technology mix is costing big dollars. NBN Co itself has calculated that the mixed technology, the multi-technology mix will cost $200 million more per year to maintain and operate, as well as reducing revenue for NBN by $300 million compared to the original fibre to the premises plan. It's an absurd hole of $500 million in NBN's economics. The legacy of the coalition government in this place is perverse. Promised to offer Australians a network that was completed more quickly than that proposed by the previous Labor government and offered faster speeds at a lower cost, and it struck out on all three fronts. The decision to badly compromise the network has actually cost Australians more. We now have a poorer network at a greater cost, and we've seen evidence for this very week. The ACCC's latest broadband speed monitoring report is a scathing indictment of the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government's multi-technology mix. In a statement accompanying the release of the report, the ACCC stated, it couldn't have been clearer, quote, "Many high-speed fibre to the node connections still don't come close to performing as promised. The results show about a quarter of those consumers on FTTN connections who are paying for high-speed 50 megabits and 100 megabits plans still do not receive anywhere near their full plan speeds at any time." The ACCC chairman Rod Sims went on to say, quote, "This Measuring Broadband Australia data clearly shows that too many consumers with FTTN connections are not receiving the speeds they are paying for. This is the faster, cheaper NBN that the coalition government has delivered. It's a perverse outcome and a perverse legacy." In 2013, the coalition were elected on a promise to complete the NBN in 3 years' time at a cost of $29.5 billion. It was fanciful. Fast forward to 2020, it's still not complete, and the price tag is now more than $50 billion. That's $20 billion over budget. 4 years behind schedule. Behind what the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government promised the Australian public. A $51 billion network that can't even deliver the broadband speeds that Australians are paying for. Now get this, in 2007, when Labor inherited the badly neglected telecommunications infrastructure bequeathed to it by the Howard government, Australia's internet speeds had it roughly ranked 50 in the world. Today, we're 68th, according to the Ookla Global Index. 68th. It's really poor company. It's really the very definition of a perverse outcome. To add insult to injury, those opposite have neglected our regions. They watched NBN build too few regional wireless towers, so existing ones became overburdened, increasing congestion and slowing connections to regional mobile users. They did this to save money when their costs started mushrooming, and they bragged about it. What they didn't brag about, incredibly, was in October last year when we discovered that NBN had cut $200 million for the fixed wireless network for the regions. This information wasn't publicly disclosed. Indeed, it was deliberately hidden from where you'd expect to find it in the corporate plan. It wasn't disclosed until we came across this information in answers to a question on notice. Typical of a government without a plan and a Prime Minister who can't be straight with the Australian public. What's happening here is that the regions are being neglected so the government can desperately try to bandage their hemorrhaging costs, which brings us to the second bill before the House, the Telecommunications Regional Broadband Scheme Charge Bill 2019. I've worked in the Australian telecommunications sector in one role or another for near on a decade, and if there's one thing that I've learned from this space is that when you're dealing with the complex technological and regulatory legacies of this sector, when you change something in one spot, you generally break something in another. The Australian telco sector as it stands today reflects decades of technology and policy trade-offs. These trade-offs interact with each other. So changes in the way that things work in one area have consequences for superficially unrelated areas elsewhere. A good example of this is the trade-offs between costs and pricing for telecommunication services in our cities, in our rural and regional areas. When Labor conceived of its plan for a national broadband network, it understood the simple fact that in a country this large, with very low population densities in some parts of it, that the costs for delivering services to our regions would be significant. The cost of a regional connection would be high, but we wanted it to remain affordable. So we rolled the NBN out based on a cross-subsidy model. That is, that metropolitan areas would pay a little more than their service costs, so the regions could acquire a service at a cost that was affordable. This cross-subsidy model generated $700 million and reflected the historic way that we've managed the higher costs in the bush against cities in the Australian telco sector. It's an egalitarian settlement, not the most optimal form from a purist perspective perhaps, but the most workable in an Australian context. There are those opposite, however, who have always wanted to play the purist in this space and unwind this egalitarian settlement. And it was disappointing that prior to the 2013 election, the Liberals encouraged other companies to deploy networks and compete directly against the NBN with full knowledge that this would undercut the NBN Co business model, the city regional cross-subsidy that's formed the basis of the Australian settlement on telecommunications policy for decades. But the ideologues in the Liberal Party have always chafed at this settlement, and they periodically break out from this settlement and start pushing positions that would break it and force the bush to wear the higher costs of telecommunication services on their own. Indeed, before the last election, the minister repeatedly flirted with the desirability of infrastructure competition with NBN Co in the cities. What the National Party thought about this flirtation by the Liberal Party with breaking the NBN cross-subsidy to the detriment of rural and regional Australia remains unknown. Presumably, they were too busy fighting each other to notice it at the time. But the minister played footsie with a development that would sabotage the NBN Co business model, and now they are introducing this new broadband tax to protect themselves from the consequences of their own flirtation. Now the minister wants to impose a new broadband tax on Australians who are on those competing networks that he once encouraged. Like his leader, the minister can't be straight about this. But Labor will be upfront about what this bill actually does. The bill will apply a new broadband tax of $7.10 per month on households and business connected to a non-NBN Co broadband network. It'll add at least $84 to the annual bill of up to 500,000 residential and business services. This new coalition tax on broadband is a new thing. It wasn't originally part of anyone's plan for the NBN. As I said earlier, the previous Labor government didn't contemplate having a broadband tax on top of an internal cross-subsidy. It was one or the other, not both. Yet now the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government wants both. We might ask what has changed to prompt this. Well, you can observe what hasn't changed, and that's the costs for the fixed wireless and satellite network have not changed at the time this new broadband tax was proposed. The cost is effectively what was forecast. What has changed is the damage that the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government's multi-technology model has done to the financials of the NBN Co. This inferior multi-technology mix, which according to NBN Co's own analysis, will cost $200 million more per annum to maintain and operate and generate $300 million less per annum. The effect of this new broadband tax will primarily be to add a price signal deterring duplication of NBN Co infrastructure in the cheaper city areas, enabling the cherry-picking of NBN Co revenues that can be applied to ensure universal access to broadband in rural and regional areas. I can understand the rationale for this. It's fair enough, and it's why we're letting this bill go through the chamber unopposed. The Shadow Minister raised issues with this that we'll address in the Senate, and we'll confront it at that time, but that will be an issue for the Senate at that time. Thank you, Speaker.
I thank the member for Gellibrand for his contribution. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I give the call to the member for Lyons.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on these bills and the Shadow Minister's amendment. A reliable broadband network has become critical to the majority of Australians, as the member for Gellibrand has noted. We rely on the internet for work, for banking, for communication, for leisure, for shopping. It's become a vital, intertwined, ingrained part of our connection to our community and to the wider world. Unfortunately, too many people in Australia, and especially in regional Australia, do not have the same ability as those in the city to enjoy the benefits of the internet. It's what we call the digital divide. And unfortunately, under this government, it's become wider, not narrower. As a result of the lack of telecommunications infrastructure and regional black spots, more needs to be done to ensure that every Australian who wants to access the internet can do so. Now, I've spoken many times in this place on the government's record on the NBN. The NBN is a national infrastructure program instituted by Labor, which, as the member for Gellibrand has noted, the then opposition leader Tony Abbott instructed his Shadow Communications Minister Malcolm Turnbull to, quote, demolish if they were to come to government, and it's one of the few promises they have sought to deliver. because indeed that's what they've done to the NBN. They've demolished the foundations of what should be one of this country's greatest infrastructure builds. They've absolutely smashed it, and I'll come to how later. The bills before the House today do two key things. It legislates certainty that all premises in Australia can continue to access broadband beyond the NBN rollout. It legislates a guarantee, similar to how we've legislated the telecommunications guarantee that ensures every Australian has access to a telephone line. This does the same for broadband. So this gives it certainty. Labor supports this, we always have. These bills also, perhaps controversially, introduces a telecommunications levy of $7 per month onto the bills on households and businesses that get their broadband from non-NBN networks. So this cost, of course, will go to the wholesalers, but as we know, they'll pass that cost on to their customers. So $84 a year in higher internet fees for people who get their internet from non-NBN providers. Labor's supporting that with some reluctance, I must say. We know we need to do it. We need to support this to be a constructive opposition because the NBN Co business fundamentals demand it because of the changes that this government has wrought on the NBN Co. Under Labor, this levy would not have happened. This internet tax would not have happened because we have baked in cross-subsidisation internally. We would not have required this. And as the member for Gellibrand mentioned in his speech, the reasons why, with his deep background in telecommunications, he explained perhaps much more eloquently than I can that we would not have done this because we had baked in cross-subsidisation beforehand. But under this government, there's both internal subsidisation and now they're going to slug consumers as well. So the truth of the matter is there needs to be a legislative standard in Australia where we guarantee universal access to broadband no matter where you live, particularly as we near the point where the NBN Co is likely to be privatised. We need to ensure that coverage is not motivated by making money, but is instead about ensuring there is a comprehensive network that ensures accessibility no matter where you live. I represent an electorate that's in remote and regional, and I get complaints still every day about people's lack of access to the NBN, whether it's slow service or the like. I've got a range of what the government calls a multi-technology mix customers in my electorate, the fibre to the node. I've got fibre to the premises that was rolled out under Labor. I don't get any complaints from them, Deputy Speaker, let me tell you. I don't get any complaints from people in fibre to the premises areas. I do get complaints from people in fibre to the node areas because the copper's degraded or they're too far from an exchange or the slow service. I certainly get complaints from people on the fixed wireless service, the towers, because essentially there's too many people on those towers and of course internet use has increased so much over even the last 5 years with 4K coming in and HD, and people are streaming services and businesses have higher uses for data, that businesses and homes that are on fixed wireless towers, they're just crunching the availability of hardware on those towers, and what we are seeing is a constant need to upgrade fixed wireless and it just can't keep up with the demand because this government has underinvested in wireless, in fixed wireless. And the fact that they secretly took $200 million out of the fixed wireless network is an absolute disgrace. Is an absolute disgrace when the shortcomings of the fixed wireless network, if any aspect of the NBN system needs more investment, it's fixed wireless. And yet they took $200 million out of it and didn't want to tell the public about it until it came up in Senate estimates, and I think a Tasmanian senator, Senator Anna Urquhart, was a principal role in that, and I give hats off to Senator Urquhart for winkling that out of the NBN. There remains plenty to do with the NBN, Deputy Speaker. Under this government, NBN speeds in this country have slipped to see Australia now 68th in the world. We are behind countries like Kazakhstan and Cape Verde in Africa. I mean, to think that Australian tourists go overseas to developing nations and they get much better service in those countries than they do here at home in Australia is an absolute indictment on this government's lack of regard for telecommunications and particularly the NBN. What should have been a game changer in terms of accessibility and speed, the NBN promises, have been a disappointing disaster. Another demonstration of how the Liberals simply have not seen the opportunities, have not grasped the opportunities that modern telecommunications can deliver, not just for households and consumers, which is sometimes how we get wrapped up as politicians. We talk about movie streaming and leisure, and because people are wrapped up in their homes, but the costs to the economy, to business of not having a fully serviced NBN with fibre at the heart of it. It's just a terrible shame. As the member for Gellibrand mentioned, in 2007, when Labor came to power under Kevin Rudd, the average internet speed was 2 megabits per second. I mean, that's unthinkable now. And yet I remember the then opposition leader, Tony Abbott, saying, "Oh, we'll never need more than, I think it was 5 or 6, or some ridiculously slow speed that would never need more than that." And we've well eclipsed it. They regarded on that side of the chamber the Labor's then promise of universal access to be delusional. That's how they called it. They called it delusional. They just didn't get it. So from 1996 to 2007, when they were in government, they did nothing. As the internet was taking off around the world and the importance of the internet became more clear to people, and I was working in the media at that time, and I saw it firsthand how the internet became more integral to our newspapers' operations, first for information gathering and then for sending pages via the internet to the printer. So that's how quickly it developed, and yet over the period of that government they did absolutely nothing in terms of the fixing the infrastructure, the internet infrastructure for this nation. So 2007, Kevin Rudd comes along, sees what needs to happen, and from a standing start of nothing, from nothing, the NBN was created. So of course these things take time to develop. The genesis of the NBN took time to develop, and so that got underway. There are a few hiccups along the way, with asbestos being found in the Telstra pits. There was a lot of regulatory changes required, and then Tony Abbott comes along as the opposition leader and orders Malcolm Turnbull to demolish Labor's NBN because he wanted to make a political point. And frankly, Tony Abbott just didn't get it. I mean, I can sort of forgive Tony Abbott to some degree because he literally did not understand the importance of internet, but I won't forgive Malcolm Turnbull because he did understand. He did understand the importance of the internet, and he was more interested in his own political future than the future of the nation, because he knew how important fibre was to be at the heart of the internet. We know that he personally invested in fibre overseas, whereas here at home he was quite happy to foist upon the nation a substandard multi-technology mix that had at its heart 19th century copper. So they didn't get it then. So over the period of this government, what we've seen happen with the NBN is a complete underinvestment, an absolute underinvestment in technology, an underinvestment in political will to give Australians the internet and the broadband that they deserve. And certainly in remote and regional Australia, the digital divide is just getting worse and worse. Under Labor, what happened, Deputy Speaker, was regional areas were the first to get fibre to the premises. Places like Sorell in Tasmania, my state, in the town of Smithton, places that you wouldn't have thought would be the first to get the latest technology available. That's where internet was rolled out, fibre to the premises. And we did that for this reason, because we said regions deserve to have the same internet speeds and quality internet as the cities do. I think people are used to in this country that whenever something new and flash comes along, it's always the cities that get it first. It's always Sydney or Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth. They tend to get the best stuff first because that's where most people live, and they get the flash stuff. So Labor in 2007 said, hang on, we want to close the digital divide. Let's give it to the regions first. Let's make sure the regions get the best internet, because the cities have got pretty passable ADSL at the moment. They've got pretty good internet. They can get by for a while, but those people in the regions, they've got nothing. So let's put the good internet out there. And Labor was howled down by those opposite who claimed to represent regional Australia. They were the first ones to howl it down, claiming, oh, this makes no business sense. This doesn't pass a business test. This costs so much more. But what we have found out, of course, is that their
I thank the member for Lyons for his contribution. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I'm giving the call to the member for Indo.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak briefly in support of these bills with a few stories of reservation. With the NBN rollout at 98% and due for completion in June this year, the last parts of rural and regional Australia, the so-called hard-to-reach places, are finally being connected. The NBN provides significant economic and social benefits in regional communities. It boosts productivity, employment and innovation. And when I visit small businesses and large producers in Indi, I'm always impressed by how quickly these people pick up on the opportunities of the NBN. I've seen online recruiting agencies for rural practitioners. I've seen jewellery manufacturers. I've seen rural telehealth to support emergency departments in far remote places of my electorate. I've seen people engaging in online learning who otherwise would not have had the opportunity to get a university degree, and I'm really happy about that. But we have to keep an eye on NBN. We have to make sure that the quality of our NBN services are indeed what we truly need in rural Australia and are equal to what other Australians receive. The poor quality of telecommunications in rural and regional Australia is a long story. I won't tell you the whole story, but it is a long story. Historical underinvestment and metro-specific policy over decades means rural and regional communities are still struggling for reliable access and lagging behind in digital literacy. Nowhere has the legacy of this underinvestment and the subsequent fragility of these services been more evident than in our recent bushfires. With mobile phone towers and radio transmitters incinerated, whole communities were isolated for weeks. With the rollout of NBN almost complete, the conversation will shift now from access, the hardware, the line to the premises, the satellite installed on the roof, to quality. Does this service do what I need it to do, and is it affordable? Rural and regional Australians know that being connected is only the first step. Historically, we pay a high price for poor quality services. As the government moves now to deliver these telecommunications reforms, we need to ensure that the product actually meets the needs of the customers outside the capitals and allows regional Australians to fully participate in the digital age. Madam Deputy Speaker, today I will address two parts of these bills which go directly to these issues. Constituents in Indi access the internet via fixed wireless and satellite networks at rates many times the national average. Indeed, my own home, only 3 kilometres out of Wangaratta, receives internet this way. These methods suit rural areas with low population density, where it's not cost-effective to install a physical line. But still, these arrangements are expensive, costing an estimated $9.8 billion over the next 30 years. The regional broadband scheme, which this bill introduces, sets up a funding arrangement for these services by requiring carriers to pay $7.10 per month for each premises with superfast broadband. This change is an improvement on the current system, where NBN cross-subsidises the investment through opaque internal accounting. I'm pleased that advocates for rural and regional telecommunications support this move. These include the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, the Country Women's Association, the Isolated Children's Parents Association and the Regional Rural and Remote Communications Coalition, whose members include the National Farmers Federation and Better Internet for Rural, Regional and Remote Australia. I am concerned, however, that the new fee imposed by the scheme will increase the cost of broadband. It's up to the carriers and retailers to decide whether to pass this charge on to the consumers. Now, the government has reassured us that 95% of consumers will not experience a price rise, and for the remaining 5%, competition will put downward pressure on these prices. Look, I sincerely hope this is in fact the case and that the goal of equitable cost sharing is not used as an excuse to price gouge customers like those in my electorate. Access to the internet is becoming as essential to daily life as access to electricity or water. It's now the government's main channel for interacting with citizens. This includes Centrelink reporting, the ATO and MyGov. Yet this access is meaningless if it's unaffordable, particularly for low-income families. Coverage has to be universal, not just on paper, but in the reality of people's lives. The second part of these bills are bills that I welcome, and that's the introduction of the statutory infrastructure provider obligations on NBN Co and other carriers. These obligations will ensure that all Australian premises are able to access superfast broadband services of 25 megabits per second or better. If it's not reasonable to connect premises via fixed line, the provider must provide a fixed wireless or satellite technology solution. On fixed wireless services, voice services for consumers must be supported. All people in Australia currently have guaranteed access to a telephone voice service through the Universal Service Obligation. So this change helps build on that and provides consumers with certainty that all people in Australia, no matter where they live, have access to high-speed NBN. This news will be very welcome to constituents of mine who access the NBN via satellite or fixed wireless. But I must say these services still fall far below what they need, and I'd like to share just a couple of their stories. A constituent who lives near Cudgewa wrote to me expressing his frustration with the service he receives by satellite, the only NBN service available for his property. He and his partner are both undertaking university study by distance online to further their careers. They both actively volunteer with community groups and committees. But the current monthly data caps placed on NBN satellite customers mean they routinely run out of data. This places them at a huge disadvantage with regard to their ongoing education and involvement with the community groups that they serve. They've tried getting a bigger package, but they can't purchase any additional data due to the NBN fair use policy. As he told my office, "I'll cut to the chase. I truly feel like a second-class citizen. I'm disadvantaged simply due to my location, As I stated, those in very close proximity to us have access to far better technology at a fraction of the cost. Whilst we are left short, every month I feel for those in more remote areas who rely on this technology for their children's education. Another example is the experience of the Outdoor Education Group, or OEG, and they're based in Eildon. OEG provide challenging, hands-on experiences for school kids, giving them the opportunity to get outdoors and go beyond their comfort zone through activities such as rafting, bushwalking, camping, high and low rope courses. OEG is hugely successful. It has over 200 staff, it has a revenue of $20 million and camps right across Australia, and to date they've educated and cared for 2 million students. As you can imagine, when you're operating between locations and corralling hundreds of children, fast and reliable internet is absolutely essential, not just for business but for safety. In their location of Eildon, fixed wireless internet is the service available to them. Yet in a 10-day period last September, for 7 days, there was no connection during business hours. The account holder was not notified and there was no clear advice on the disruption when the disruption would end. Staff were forced to hotspot using their phones, which meant they couldn't access the internal server, severely impacting on their productivity. The outages are completely unacceptable. As OEG told my office, this seems unbelievable to me and totally discourages businesses from operating in regional areas. NBN do not answer to anyone and are being very quiet about what's going on and what's been causing the issues I've mentioned, especially moving into summer and being in a bushfire-prone area of the state. I don't believe a reasonable person could expect a business to run efficiently with these vague notifications, particularly an organisation that is regularly conducting interviews and meetings via the internet, and that was a direct quote. The NBN has also recently reduced OEG's upload speeds by 50%. Upload speed is crucial as most of their work is done between different offices and they rely on cloud-based applications with data frequently uploaded as work is saved. After a meeting between myself, NBN and OEG, I was pleased that NBN agreed to schedule outages before OEG's busy period commencing in February this year. OEG is a huge successful employer which has made rural and regional Australia its home base. We want and we need more of these businesses outside of our capital cities so our regions can prosper. Extensive issues with NBN outages cause headaches and difficulties for regional businesses. How many other potential businesses decide that they simply wouldn't take the risk on moving to regional Australia? And of course, I can't stand here and talk about NBN without at least mentioning mobile phone black spots too, because they still remain. The famous Oxley Bush Markets, which celebrated its 40th anniversary in November 2019 and last month won the rural city of Wangaratta's Community Event of the Year, struggled with connectivity issues which meant it was a gamble using FPOS to sell their wares. How much more commerce could the 175 stallholders conduct if they just had reliable reception? And so, as I conclude, I'm a member of the Joint Standing Committee on the National Broadband Network, and I'm absolutely committed to keeping a close eye on the rollout of NBN to ensure that rural and regional Australians not only get NBN, but they get the quality NBN that they need.
I thank the member for Indi for her contribution. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I give the call to the member for Macon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I note with interest that there are no government members that wish to speak to this legislation, the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment, Competition and Consumer Bill 2019, Telecommunications Regional Broadband Scheme Charge Bill 2019 as well. Madam Deputy Speaker, the two most significant national projects that the Morrison government was entrusted to deliver for all Australians were the NBN rollout and the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme rollout. Both have been dismal failures of this government. They were national rollouts that the previous Labor government had done the groundwork on, and indeed all the difficult work in respect to the preparation was already done. The failure of the Morrison government to roll out both the NDIS and the National Broadband Network on time, on budget and meet community expectations highlights this government's incompetency. This is a government now in its third term. It has had plenty of time to settle in, to carry out whatever reviews it thought it needed at the time it came into office, and to deliver on the election promises it made to the Australian people. It has failed to do so. The NBN rollout, now under this government in its 7th year, is a mess, with consumers every day raising concerns and frustrations about NBN connections and services. The Coalition decided in their wisdom to change Labor's National Broadband Network rollout, claiming their rollout, this is the Coalition rollout, would enable the NBN to be delivered faster and cheaper. What we have seen after 7 years is that they have failed on both counts. Costs have blown out to $51 billion. The rollout is 4 years behind schedule, and the service is failing to meet community standards on so many fronts. I have lost count of the number of people who have contacted my office over the years with NBN difficulties. The Morrison government's National Broadband Network rollout has been badly designed, which is why this legislation is now before the House. They are trying to fix another problem, the problem of funding, and that also goes to the services that are being provided. And it's a funding problem that arises because of the very structure of their rollout. Madam Deputy Speaker, in today's society, broadband connection or internet connection is no longer a luxury, it's not an option, it is a necessity. Nearly all businesses and nearly all business, including government services, are transacted through the internet. Without the internet, you cannot get on with your normal daily life anymore. The two major entities that have responsibility for enabling National Broadband Network connectivity are Telstra and the NBN Co. Both have been the subject of thousands of complaints each year to the Telecommunications Ombudsman. In 2018-19, there were 132,387 complaints. Madam Deputy Speaker, some might argue that those complaints dropped from the previous year. My view is that if the complaint numbers have dropped, it's simply because people have given up complaining because they know it ultimately results in no action. Both Telstra and NBN Co have a monopoly over their service sector and can be very difficult to deal with, particularly for people with limited communication skills or who are not familiar with new technology. Madam Deputy Speaker, I was recently contacted by a local person who has extensive knowledge in the telecommunication sector, a person who has spent considerable time to not only put together his thoughts on the NBN, and Telstra for that matter, but also to look at things that could be done to improve the services. And he listed for me 12 issues that need to be addressed, and I'm going to go through them one at a time. The first, poor technical support from overseas call centres staffed by people who have often have limited training and no understanding of the Australian context. Frequently, there are deficiencies in their technical language capabilities. Secondly, physical cabling failures and limitations within the copper network used for the last section of the fibre to the node technology. Thirdly, high prices for services compared to other countries. Fourthly, packaging of services by providers into bundles, which cannot be broken down into separately priced items to permit customers to make a fair comparison with their competitors. Fifthly, obfuscation of costs and constraints in marketing of products and services, and in contracts which might only be discovered by consumers when a problem arises. Can I say on that issue, that seems to be a common problem, that when a problem arises and someone then goes back to their contract, they suddenly find out that the problem that they have encountered is not the responsibility of their provider or of NBN or of Telstra, and there is a backwards and forwards process in respect to who it is that they need to get on side to fix the problem. Sixthly, providers often phase out bundles as the contracts expire and replace them with much more expensive options. Number 7, selling services such as internet access with speed boost yet failing to purchase sufficient bandwidth from NBN Co to meet the demand of their customers. Again, a common problem. Number 8, providers refusing to provide access to technical data on the modems and equipment they provide to customers, limiting options for consumers to solve problems themselves or to turn to third parties for technical support. Madam Deputy Speaker, on that issue alone, I fail to understand why the technical data relating to modems and other telecommunications equipment is not made available to all people so that people can get on with either doing their own repairs, maintenance, whatever it is, or get a technician of their choice to come in and do it. But yet that is not the case. Number 9, failure to disclose the full ramifications when transferring to the NBN. These, including the potential need to rewire existing home or business telephone networks, with limits on how many handsets can be connected to the modem and limitations with location of phone outlets. Again, I see homes and I speak to people who have connected to the NBN and then suddenly find that they cannot have the same phone system in their home that they had before the NBN connection. Number 10, consumers are also not always aware that in most cases, standard landline services will not work during a power outage. And the previous speaker spoke about that in her own community as a result of the bushfires. It's a serious problem because many of the people that are now connected are older people who rely on their telephone not only to make calls, but quite often they might have the emergency alarm systems that are also connected through the same system, and if it fails, there is no way of anyone knowing if they are in need. Number 11, some users who only want a basic landline service end up paying more than they need to for bundles with large data allowances. And number 12, when encountering technical difficulties, consumers often get caught between their internet service provider and NBN Co, with each saying the problem is the other's fault. I referred to that earlier on, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I say that seems to be one of the most common problems we encounter, certainly in my community. And the difficulty in navigating through all of the various parties is something that I can only empathise with consumers about. It is sometimes near impossible to get through to them. And indeed, some of the people who have come to my office have only done so as a last resort because they have exhausted all of the options they believe they have to them in getting the problem resolved. And inevitably, after coming to my office, we're able to get someone from NBN to perhaps coordinate the services required and get the issue resolved. But it's never easy. Madam Deputy Speaker, other issues that have also been raised with me or my office include that when switching over to the NBN, which many consumers have needed to do to maintain their phone or internet access, some have had to choose between paying a higher monthly cost or accepting a service that is inferior to what they had. Many consumers who received the NBN by HFC experienced significant delays in the rollout or technical problems. Consumers sometimes experience lengthy delays trying to transfer to the NBN, and where sometimes they lose phone or internet services for extended periods during the transfer. And lastly, often home security systems or personal alarms are either not compatible with the NBN and would not function in the event of a power outage. Now, I realise they can get a battery backup in some cases, but again, if you're not familiar or conversant with new technology, you might not have done that. And whilst there is an NBN scheme to assist with the costs of replacement, there are some limitations and there will still be some out-of-pocket costs to the consumers. Madam Deputy Speaker, many of these issues have been caused by or exacerbated as a consequence of the government's multi-technology mix rather than Labor's original plan for a fibre to the premises coverage, which would have covered around 93% of the nation. Other speakers have referred to the internet speeds. The New Daily recently reported that Australia's broadband internet ranked 4th slowest in the OECD world. 4th slowest. In global internet speed rankings, Australia has fallen to 68th of 177 countries. These are recent figures. These are not old figures. And whilst the government might dismiss those figures and come back with some excuse as to how they are not correct and the like, can I say to the government, the reality is that there have now been too many reports now showing that people are not getting the internet speeds or quality of service that they were led to expect. Madam Deputy Speaker, reliable, high-speed, world-class internet services are important for the nation. They are important for business productivity and efficiency. They are an essential service. They should no longer be treated as something that consumers have choices about. It is part of the world and the life that we live. If we cannot deliver the services that both residents and business need, we as a nation cannot move forward, and nor can we be competitive with the rest of the world. This legislation, I know, tries to address some problems, but quite frankly, this government stands condemned for the failure to roll out the service that this country needs in 2020 and the failure to deliver on the promises it made to the Australian people.
I thank the member for making for his contribution. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to. I give the call to the Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to sum up the debate in the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment Competition and Consumer Bill 2019 and the Telecommunications Regional Broadband Scheme Charge Bill 2019. And I express my thanks to all parliamentary colleagues who have spoken in this debate. These bills implement a comprehensive three-part package to improve the regulatory framework for the supply of high-speed broadband by amending separation rules and creating new supply and funding arrangements. These bills will improve the provision of high-speed broadband in Australia, firstly by making carrier separation rules for high-speed residential networks more effective but also more flexible and giving carriers greater scope to invest in superfast networks and to compete. Secondly, they improve the provision of high-speed broadband by introducing new statutory infrastructure provider obligations on NBN Co and others to support the ongoing delivery of high-speed broadband services. Thirdly, these bills establish the Regional Broadband Scheme, which will provide transparent and equitable long-term funding for NBN Co's satellite and fixed wireless services in regional and remote areas. Madam Deputy Speaker, access to the National Broadband Network is estimated to have contributed $1.2 billion to Australia's GDP in 2017, excluding the stimulus effect of the rollout. Once complete, the NBN is projected to boost Australia's GDP by $10.4 billion per annum. The government's reform package embodied in these bills is designed to allow all Australians to participate and share in the social and economic benefits of one of our country's largest infrastructure projects. Consumers will benefit from the statutory infrastructure provider measures, the purpose of which is that all Australians can access high-speed quality internet services. The rules set out baseline standards for these services: peak download speeds of at least 25 megabits per second and peak upload speeds of at least 5 megabits per second. These services also need to support voice communication on fixed line or fixed wireless networks. Consumers in regional Australia will benefit from the Regional Broadband Scheme, which establishes a transparent and equitable long-term funding arrangement for NBN Co's fixed wireless and satellite networks. These networks are improving business, social, educational and health outcomes for residents of regional and remote Australia. The Regional Broadband Scheme will require all carriers to pay $7.10 per month for each premises on their network with a high-speed fixed-line broadband service. This charge is capped at $7.10, indexed to CPI, to provide greater regulatory and investment certainty and to support market competition. The Regional Broadband Scheme will level the playing field by spreading the cost of Australia's investment in regional and remote broadband services equitably across NBN Co and NBN comparable networks. Importantly, the costs of NBN Co's fixed wireless and satellite networks are built into NBN Co's existing pricing model over time, so establishing the Regional Broadband Scheme will not produce any one-time price shock for NBN customers. In combination with the statutory infrastructure provider regime, the Regional Broadband Scheme will give confidence to residents of regional and remote Australia that essential, affordable broadband services will be available to them and will remain available in the future. The package of measures set out in these bills strengthens competition, but recognises in a competitive market all participants should contribute towards the cost of providing loss-making broadband services in regional and remote Australia. There has been recognition of the potential need for a levy to support the provision of loss-making broadband services in regional and remote Australia since the initial implementation study for the NBN was carried out in 2010. The Labor Party and representatives of that party have been on the record saying that they accept that a levy might need to be introduced, and in its 2010 Statement of Expectations to NBN Co, the then Labor government said it was considering introduction of a levy to prevent opportunistic cherry-picking. The package of measures set out in this bill delivers important outcomes for consumers, and that is why these bills are supported by consumer groups and by regional stakeholders, including the National Farmers Federation and the Regional, Rural and Remote Communications Coalition. These bills also deliver important outcomes for industry, with more opportunities for competition at both the network and retail levels. These important reforms are a critical step towards all Australians having access to the affordable, high-speed, quality internet services they need to fully participate in today's digital society, and I commend these bills to the House.